rescinding the agency agreement, or sometimes often referred to as the vendor's right to rescind the agency agreement. That's what we're going to talk about in this presentation, and we're going to be talking about two aspects of it. We will be discussing how does a vendor rescind an agency agreement legally, and how can the vendor give up or waive their right to rescission. Two aspects of it that we'll cover today. So let's talk about a situation where the vendor has signed an agency agreement with the agent, and for whatever reason, the vendor has decided either not to sell the property or not to use that particular agent. Doesn't really matter which one. So they've decided, I don't want to go ahead with the agency agreement. There's two things that have to be done. There's a timing aspect to the rescission, and there's a documentation aspect to the rescission. In terms of timing, the vendor must communicate to the agent no later than 5 p.m. on the next business day that they are going to rescind the agency agreement. Now, 5 p.m. on the next business day would include a Saturday, but does not include a public holiday. So having got the timing aspect clear in your mind, the documentation aspect is equally important. Section 60 of the Act is where you look for information in respect of how it's done. Now, it's got to be in writing, so that means the vendor must put their notice of rescission in writing. It must be addressed to the agent. The language in the document or the letter must make it clear that they intend to rescind the agency agreement. Obviously, it's got to be signed by the vendor or vendors, plural, and or their legal representatives. And it obviously must be delivered to the agent in a timely fashion, in a way that would be very clear that a message, that document has been communicated. So we're talking, ideally, a hand delivery would be a very obvious way to make sure that rescission is received. Now, question. Can you extend the period of rescission? And the answer is yes, we can go longer than 5 p.m. on the next business day if the agreement to do that is in the agency agreement itself, or the agent has agreed to extend it. In either of those circumstances, the vendor's right to a cooling off period can be extended. So that's clear there in terms of does the vendor have the right to rescind, and if so, how is it done? The other side of the story, as it were, is can the vendor waive their right to that rescission? Now, once again, we're not going to talk about how and why the vendor would want to waive their 1 or more day cooling off as long as it's been agreed to. We're just going to talk about the mechanics of how it's done. So in order for the vendor to waive their cooling off period, the agent must be doing things prior to the signing of the agreement. What the agent must be doing is the agent must be giving to the vendor a blank copy of the proposed agreement, together with, if it's residential property, they've got to also give the vendor a copy of the consumer guide. Now, the consumer guide is something which you probably are very aware of. You must give a copy of the consumer guide to every single vendor of residential property at the time you sign them up, which is a common understanding. But when you're trying to get the vendor to waive their right to cool off under the agency agreement, remember that you must give the vendor a copy of the blank agency agreement or the proposed agency agreement, together with, if it's residential property as opposed to rural property, you must also make sure that they get a copy of the consumer guide. Now, having given the vendor a copy of those two documents, you must also satisfy the timing of the provision of those documents. Now, the requirement under the Act says that you must give the vendor at least 1 day before you sign that agreement. In other words, you've got to provide those two documents to them at least 1 day before they sign the agreement, and no more than 1 month before. So the longest you have is a month before, and you must give them at least 1 day. Now that gives you a very clear window during which you can give those documents to the vendor with the intention that the vendor is going to waive their right to rescind, right? Now, in return for that, the vendor must give you a waiver. So you give them 2 documents in the case of residential property, and they give you a waiver in return. And that waiver is a gazetted form. In other words, the government has decided that there is certain requirements that must go into that document by gazette. And they really cover 5 basic elements, right? The first one, obviously, is to identify who the vendor is and the property in question. They must then identify the fact that they intend to waive their cooling off period. The third requirement is that they must then state that they understand the consequences of waiving their right to rescind. They then have to indicate that they have received the necessary documents from the agent, meaning a copy of the proposed agreement together with a copy of the consumer guide, if it's relevant for, let's say, residential property. And then the final requirement is that they have to declare that they have not signed the agreement before signing the waiver. So if you've got all those 5 requirements, then that is your the content of a compliant vendor waiver document. So I'm hoping that's clear. So on the one side, we've talked about how does a vendor rescind their agency agreement properly and legally. And on the other side, we've talked about how does a vendor waive that particular right. We have not talked about why that would happen. Quite frankly, I'm not even sure why a vendor would be required to waive their cooling off period, but that's another discussion for another time. So I'm hoping that that has been useful information. My name is Craig Swan. That's with 1 N, like the white bird. You can reach me at craigs@leveragegroup.com.au. If you want to reach me through Instagram, it's at Craig_Leverage Group. I'm always interested in your comments and feedback, so do please let me know if you have any queries or comments. A big shout out to Anna. Anna was the student who suggested that I cover this topic, so many thanks, Anna. Now, I'm wishing you all the very, very best out there in the trenches as you are doing what you do best as agents. So happy hunting, and of course, make sure you stay safe.